April 1980. In the black void of the Iranian desert, engines thundered across a barren stretch of sand known only to American operatives as Desert One. Moments later, a blinding fireball lit up the night sky. Metal twisted, men burned, and in a matter of seconds, what was supposed to be the most daring rescue mission in U.S. history collapsed into smoldering wreckage. 8 American servicemen lay dead. Their mission, a top-secret operation to save 52 hostages held in Tehran, was over before it had truly begun. The mission was called Operation Eagle Claw. It was born out of desperation, fueled by national humiliation, and executed with one of the most complex special operations plans ever attempted. But what happened in the Iranian desert wasn't just a tactical failure. It was a moment that changed the future of U.S. military strategy forever. It exposed the limits of American power. It ended political careers, and it left a permanent scar on the soul of U.S. special operations. This is the story of how it all went wrong, how elite warriors, high-level planners, and a sitting president gambled everything and lost. If you're interested in forgotten military history, high-stakes operations, and stories the government would rather not talk about, make sure to subscribe and like this video. It helps us bring you more deep dives like this one, where history's most explosive moments are told in full, brutal detail. Because in the shadows of history, not everything goes according to plan. To understand Operation Eagle Claw, you have to go back to a moment when the world turned upside down, when one of America's closest allies in the Middle East was suddenly swept away by fire, fury, and revolution. In 1979, the Islamic Revolution exploded onto the streets of Iran. Decades of Western-backed monarchy under Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi came crashing down. In his place rose a towering figure, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, a religious cleric exiled for years, now returned to lead a movement of radical transformation. To many Iranians, he was a savior. To the United States, he was the embodiment of chaos. Khomeini's message was clear. Iran would no longer be a puppet of foreign powers. America, which had supported the Shah for decades, quickly became the #1 enemy. Anti-American sentiments spread like wildfire. Streets filled with chants of "Death to America," effigies burned, flags trampled. On November 4th, 1979, the fury reached a boiling point. A mob of Iranian students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. Armed only with chains, slogans, and the weight of the revolution behind them, they overran the compound in hours. Inside, 66 Americans were taken hostage. Diplomats, Marines, and civilians. Blindfolded, bound, and paraded in front of cameras. The footage shocked the world. For the United States, it was humiliation on live television. For President Jimmy Carter, it was a political nightmare. In the early days, Carter pursued diplomacy, sanctions, negotiations through back channels. But nothing worked. Khomeini refused to budge. The students refused to release the hostages. They were bargaining chips, symbols of a new Iran's defiance. The American public watched helplessly as day after day passed. The media called it the hostage crisis. ABC began a nightly news segment titled, "America Held Hostage." It aired every single evening. By the time the mission to rescue the hostages was launched, that number had climbed today 172. The pressure on Carter was crushing. Every delay, every failed negotiation, every image of blindfolded hostages pushed the American psyche closer to the edge. The president's approval ratings plummeted. His cabinet debated options, but none seemed viable. An outright invasion would provoke war. A drone strike was still science fiction, and time was running out. Behind the scenes, the Pentagon was already working on something different. Something bold. They were preparing to send in a small team of elite warriors to go into the heart of hostile territory, strike fast, and bring the hostages home alive. But the odds were staggering. Tehran wasn't some jungle outpost or isolated compound. It was a bustling capital of over 4 million people, surrounded by anti-American militia, hostile government forces, and watchful eyes. The idea of infiltrating it undetected, assaulting a fortified embassy, and flying 52 hostages out to safety sounded like something out of a movie. But with no other options left on the table, Carter gave the order. Operation Eagle Claw was born, and the countdown to disaster had begun. The order was given. The mission was greenlit, and now the most ambitious rescue operation in American military history had to be planned from scratch. What followed was a logistical and tactical puzzle so complex, so interwoven with risk, that it bordered on the impossible. The United States was about to attempt a surgical military operation in the heart of a hostile country, over 1,000 miles from the nearest friendly base, without triggering a war, alerting the enemy, or getting a single hostage killed. The plan would be called Operation Eagle Claw, and to this day, it stands as a case study in how even the most elite forces can be undone by one thing: complexity. To pull this off, the Pentagon turned to an elite unit that most of the country had never even heard of: Delta Force. At the time, Delta was still a young unit. Created just 2 years earlier by Colonel Charles Beckwith, Delta was modeled after the British SAS and trained to handle high-risk hostage rescues. But Delta couldn't do it alone. The operation would require coordination between nearly every major branch of the U.S. military: Delta for the assault, the Air Force for transport and fuel logistics, the Navy for launch and recovery, and Marine Corps pilots to fly the helicopters in and out of Iran. The CIA would provide intelligence on the ground, including 2 operatives who would secure vehicles and safe houses inside Tehran. It was an all-hands-on-deck operation. And the plan? It unfolded in 7 stages, each one more fragile than the last. First, a fleet of C-130 Hercules aircraft would fly from Oman, carrying Delta operators and critical equipment, and land at a remote desert site in Iran. This site, chosen for its flat terrain and desolation, was codenamed Desert One. Then 8 RH-53D Sea Stallion helicopters would take off from the USS Nimitz in the Arabian Sea and fly over 600 miles to meet the C-130S at Desert One. There, under the cover of darkness, the helicopters would refuel from the parked tankers, load up the Delta team, and continue on to a second desert hide site closer to Tehran. From that second location, the team would rest during the day and then rendezvous at night with CIA-supplied trucks driven by local assets. Those trucks would transport Delta to the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. The next phase? A midnight assault on the embassy compound. Delta would breach the perimeter, eliminate the guards, and secure the hostages, all within a window of minutes. Once the hostages were free, they would be rushed to a nearby soccer stadium where the helicopters would land and extract everyone, operators, hostages, and support personnel, before flying back out to a waiting aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf. On paper, the plan had all the markings of elite precision, but behind the scenes there were concerns, and many of them came from the very people tasked with carrying it out. The aircraft chosen were not designed for this kind of mission. The RH-53Ds, while reliable for minesweeping and transport, were not intended to fly deep into desert terrain under hostile conditions. The C-130S had to be refitted for in-air refueling and rough landings. And there was no room for mechanical failure. Every piece of equipment had to work perfectly. Navigation also posed a serious challenge. This was 1980, there was no GPS. Pilots would have to rely on compass bearings and visual landmarks in one of the most remote regions on Earth, at night in sandstorms. Then there was the timeline. The mission required near-perfect synchronization across multiple continents, dozens of aircraft, and hundreds of personnel, with the eyes of an entire hostile regime watching. One small error could unravel everything. But despite the risks, President Carter approved the plan. The go signal was issued, troops were briefed, aircraft were readied, and the countdown began. At 7:30 p.m. on April 24, 1980, the first aircraft left the ground. Operation Eagle Claw was in motion. April 24, 1980. The mission was a go. At 7:30 p.m., under the cloak of darkness, a group of C-130 Hercules transports lifted off from an airstrip in Oman. On board were members of Delta Force, Air Force combat controllers, medical personnel, and a classified arsenal of equipment. Their destination, a remote stretch of Iranian desert known as Desert One. This would be the first staging area, the nerve center where helicopters and transports would link up, refuel, and push deeper into Iran. But even before the first aircraft touched down, the operation was already beginning to unravel. Far out at sea, Aboard the USS Nimitz and USS Coral Sea, 8 RH-53D Sea Stallion helicopters launched into the night sky. These massive machines were tasked with flying over 600 miles through hostile airspace, hugging low to the earth, weaving between radar coverage zones, all to rendezvous at Desert 1. But within the first hour, the mission's greatest enemy revealed itself, not the Iranian military, but nature itself. As the helicopters passed over the mountains of southern Iran, they were swallowed by a massive haboob, a violent wall of dust and sand that reached thousands of feet into the atmosphere. Visibility dropped to near zero. Instruments were choked, blades rattled, engines strained against the storm. One helicopter, suffering instrument failure and reduced visibility, turned back. The mission was now down to 7. Another broke down mid-flight, hydraulic failure. The crew was forced to land in the middle of nowhere and await pickup. They would never make it to Desert 1. Now only 6 helicopters remained, the bare minimum required to complete the mission. Back on the ground, the C-130S had landed at Desert 1 and were waiting in total darkness. The combat controllers set up infrared landing beacons to guide in the helicopters. But the site wasn't as deserted as planners had hoped. First, a civilian bus, loaded with 44 passengers, blundered down the dirt road that cut through the site. The Americans halted the bus, detained the passengers, and secured them at gunpoint. Moments later, an Iranian fuel truck barreled toward the scene. It ignored signals to stop. A Delta Force operator fired a law rocket into the cab, destroying the vehicle in a fireball. The scene at Desert 1 was no longer covert. Then the helicopters arrived, late, stressed, and battered. The crews were exhausted, disoriented, and shaken by the sandstorm. And then came the final blow. One of the 6 remaining helicopters was found to have a faulty hydraulic system. It was deemed unsafe to continue. That brought the number down to 5. 5 helicopters wasn't enough. Colonel Charles Beckwith, commander of Delta Force, made the call. Without at least 6 helicopters, the mission couldn't proceed. He requested permission to abort. Word was sent to President Carter. He agreed. The rescue was over, but the danger wasn't. Now they had to extract from enemy territory, quickly and without drawing further attention. The helicopters and transports began preparing for departure. On the tarmac, a C-130 tanker was loaded with personnel and fuel. One of the RH-53D helicopters moved into position to refuel. But as it maneuvered in the dark, swirling sand made visibility nearly impossible. Then came the flash. The helicopter's rotor clipped the fuselage of the C-130. In an instant, both aircraft erupted into flame. The explosion was thunderous. Fire tore through the hulls. Ammunition cooked off. Fuel ignited. Men were thrown to the ground. 8 American servicemen were killed instantly. 5 were Air Force flight crew. 3 were Marines aboard the helicopter. Several others were burned or injured, scrambling to escape the firestorm. What had begun as a daring rescue mission had become a massacre on the runway. The survivors abandoned the remaining helicopters and loaded onto the surviving transports. As the sun began to rise, they lifted off, leaving behind the charred wreckage and the bodies of their fallen comrades. Back in Tehran, the hostages never heard a thing. For them, the night passed like any other, blindfolded, guarded, and waiting. But for the men of Operation Eagle Claw, the nightmare had already begun. In the chaos of the desert night, everything fell apart in seconds. At 2:40 a.m., as the RH-53D helicopter attempted to reposition for refueling, it clipped the fuselage of a C-130 Hercules transport aircraft. In an instant, the sky erupted. A towering fireball tore through the pre-dawn darkness, engulfing both aircraft in flames. The explosion rocked the sand flat. Debris and burning fuel rained down. Screams echoed over the roaring fire. Ammunition inside the aircraft began to cook off, turning the wreck into a deadly, self-sustaining inferno. 8 Americans were killed instantly. 5 were Air Force crewmen aboard the C-130. 3 were Marine aviators inside the helicopter. Their bodies were incinerated in the wreckage, beyond recognition, beyond retrieval. Others nearby were burned or thrown by the blast. Survivors staggered through the smoke, coughing and disoriented. Some dove into the sand to shield themselves. Medics rushed to stabilize the wounded, while flames lit up the night for miles. shattering any hope of stealth. With the mission aborted and lives lost, the new objective was simple: get out. Colonel Charles Beckwith made the call. The remaining helicopters were no longer viable. The survivors had no choice but to abandon them, leaving behind equipment, weapons, and the charred bodies of their brothers in arms. They loaded onto the remaining C-130s and prepared to flee. There was no time for ceremony, no time to mourn. As dawn approached, the aircraft roared down the makeshift runway and lifted off into the desert sky, leaving behind the wreckage of a mission that would never be completed. By sunrise, Iranian villagers had arrived at Desert One. They found the bodies, the burned-out aircraft, the discarded American gear, and within hours, the Iranian government knew everything. In Washington, word of the disaster hit like a hammer. President Carter, who had watched the operation unfold via secure communications, was silent. The cost of failure wasn't just operational, it was human, political, and deeply personal. Within 24 hours, the Pentagon held a press conference. The American public was told the truth. The rescue mission had failed. 8 U.S. servicemen were dead. The hostages remained in captivity. For the families of those killed, there was no comfort. Their sons and husbands had died in a distant desert, not in combat, but in a chaotic, aborted mission never meant to be seen. For Carter, it was a turning point, one from which he would never politically recover. But for the U.S. military, the consequences of Desert One were just beginning. The morning after Desert One, the world woke up to a new chapter in American military history, one written not in triumph, but in tragedy. The official announcement came quickly. Standing before the press, President Jimmy Carter delivered the news with visible exhaustion. "I ordered this rescue mission prepared," he said. "I made the decision to proceed with it. It was my decision to attempt the rescue operation. It was my decision to cancel it when problems developed. The responsibility is fully my own." The words were clear. The message was devastating. Across the United States, shock turned to grief. The 8 fallen servicemen were hailed as heroes. Their names read solemnly on national broadcasts. But the bigger story, what had gone wrong, how it could have happened, drew criticism from every direction. Military analysts pointed to the operation's complexity. Politicians attacked the lack of coordination. News anchors played grainy footage of the wreckage over and over again. For many Americans, it was the first time they realized their military, once thought invincible, could fail so completely, even with its most elite forces in play. And the hostages? They remained in Tehran, still bound, still blindfolded, still bargaining chips in a geopolitical standoff. The rescue had failed, and now the fear was retaliation. What if the Iranians executed the hostages in response? But Ayatollah Khomeini didn't need to. The failure was propaganda enough. Iranian media proudly displayed the remains of the American aircraft. The wreckage at Desert One became a symbol of defiance. One of the burned-out helicopters was paraded through the streets of Tehran. Iranian officials mocked the U.S., calling the mission proof that God had defeated the great Satan. Back in Washington, the Carter administration was in freefall. Public confidence collapsed. The hostage crisis had already damaged Carter's presidency, but now it was a death sentence. Approval ratings dropped into the 30s. His image as a moral, measured leader had been overtaken by perceptions of indecision and weakness. The failed mission would cast a long shadow over the 1980 presidential election. Ronald Reagan, the Republican challenger, capitalized on the disaster, promising to restore America's strength and global standing. He campaigned on rebuilding the military, projecting force, and never letting the United States be humiliated again. And the hostages? They would remain in prison for another 270 days. Finally, on January 20th, 1981, just minutes after Ronald Reagan was sworn in as president, the Iranians released the 52 remaining Americans. Not a single shot had been fired. No more helicopters launched. It was a final insult. They waited for Carter to leave office before letting the hostages go. For Carter, it was a painful end. For Reagan, it was a symbolic beginning. And for the military, it was a wake-up call that would shake the foundation of American special operations. But Eagle Claw's story didn't end in the desert. In the wake of the failure, the Department of Defense launched a full-scale investigation. The after-action reports were blunt, damning, and urgent. They didn't just look at what went wrong, they began the process of building something better. From the ashes of Desert One, a new kind of warfighter would be born. Operation Eagle Claw didn't just end in failure, it ignited a revolution within the U.S. military. The operation exposed flaws that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. A lack of coordination between service branches, inadequate command structures, poor equipment integration, and no unified doctrine for special operations. The mission's complexity had been its undoing, but the real problem was systemic. In the aftermath, the Pentagon launched an exhaustive investigation. The result was the Holloway Report, a no-holds-barred analysis that identified the root causes of the disaster. It pulled no punches. Eagle Claw had been doomed by fragmented command, insufficient training, and a patchwork of forces that had never rehearsed together until the mission itself. The consequences were swift and permanent. In the years that followed, the United States began a full restructuring of its special operations capabilities. What emerged was a more focused, more lethal, and far more unified force. In 1987, the U.S. established Special Operations Command SOCOM, a central command structure with control over all special operations units across every military branch. Under SOCOM, the elite would be trained, equipped, and deployed under a single authority. At the same time, the government created Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC, a highly secretive umbrella organization designed to bring together Tier 1 units like Delta Force, SEAL Team 6, and others into one coordinated strike capability. Another result of Eagle Claw was the creation of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, known as the Night Stalkers. Formed specifically to provide dedicated air support for special operations, the Night Stalkers would go on to become legends in their own right, masters of low-level flying, night missions, and rapid insertion behind enemy lines. The military also invested in better equipment, specialized aircraft, advanced training programs, and mission rehearsal facilities. No longer would America rely on repurposed machinery or improvisation. From now on, special operations would be treated as a precision tool, not an afterthought. And perhaps most importantly, the lessons of Desert One were never forgotten. They were studied, dissected, and drilled into every generation of U.S. special operators. Not as a cautionary tale, but as a reminder that even the most elite force can fail if the system behind it is broken. In the years that followed, those rebuilt capabilities would be tested. In Panama, in Somalia, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in some of the most dangerous corners of the world, American special operations would deliver success where failure had once defined them. But it all began here, in the Iranian desert, on a mission that never reached its target. Operation Eagle Claw was a disaster, but it was also a turning point, because sometimes it's not the victory that shapes the future, it's the failure that forces you to rebuild it. If you found this deep dive into Operation Eagle Claw powerful, disturbing, or thought-provoking, make sure to hit that like button. It helps the video reach more viewers who care about the hidden stories of military history. And if you want more forgotten operations, failed missions, and the moments that shaped modern warfare, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We're just getting started. Drop a comment below. What do you think would have happened if Eagle Claw had succeeded? Would it have changed the course of the Cold War? Would Carter have won re-election? We'll see you in the next one. Until then, stay sharp, stay curious, and remember, not every war is won on the battlefield.